Welcome once again to Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer. I'm Kim Todd. Together we will unearth the biggest topics in Nebraska's gardening world. Today we're going to be focusing on hops and the research and breeding being done at the university. So microbrewing and brewing your own at home and getting all that great, interesting, hoppy and strange flavored beer has really become a trend, not only in Nebraska, but across the country. We also are seeing a lot of home brewers and maybe small microbrewers who want to know where the ingredients in their beer are coming from. So we're doing hops on campus. So Stacy and Keenan talk a little bit about the research, talk about what's going on. What are the hops, where, and why are we doing this?
Well, one of the interesting things about hops I noticed about 5 years ago was how popular it was. And it seemed like a lot of people were getting on the bandwagon to grow it. And my question was, working with specialty crops, I thought, well, if we're going to maybe see a way to make some income with this, we needed to see whether or not there was some continuity in the productivity of hops. So the work I've been doing started about 5 years ago, where we put in 8 cultivars, which are pretty common in the industry, and planted them in 4 different places across the state, just to see if we could see any type of productivity and uniformity in the plant.
So you started in specialty crops thinking, interesting. And Keenan, you are...
I'm a turfgrass geneticist. And last I checked, you don't mow hops. So,
well, you probably could, but you're not going to get any hops.
Exactly, right? Maybe at the beginning of the season. So I really got into it. I work primarily with a dioecious grass plant, and hops are also dioecious, so that means they have separate male and female plant, or male and female, plants.
Right.
Most plants have perfect flowers, where the flowers have both male and female parts. And so I've been really trying to develop a dioecious breeding program, and so hops was a natural transition for me from turf. Still work on turf, that's my primary appointment, and I like beer, so hops is easy to work on.
And Stacy, you're not exactly a beer guy, but you're learning because of all those differences and the uniqueness, right?
Yeah, I mean, the flavors are pretty fascinating. That's the interesting thing about hops, is you get these aromatic qualities, which are pretty nice to get from them.
Yeah, and from a breeding perspective, it's ridiculous. There's more than 200 flavoring compounds in hops, and so it's a really complex system to work in. And trying to breed and develop for new interesting flavors and some of those kinds of things is really a challenge, because there's so much variability to work with.
So why are you after dioecious? Or why?
Yeah, that's just an interest
Okay,
of mine,
just
not
an interest.
anything particular. It's just less than 5% of flowering plants are dioecious, so it's just an interesting niche to work in.
So the cool thing about what Keenan and I are doing is I just kind of stepped into it because I like to look at potential markets or ways people can make some additional income. So we needed to see, can this crop actually be consistent, uniform? From that, Keenan has collected plant material from all across the state that's been here for well over 100 years, and I'll let you explain.
Yeah, so the primary hops production market is in the Pacific Northwest.
Right.
And as you mentioned, there's been growth in craft breweries, and
Right.
There's demand by craft brewers to grow or to have access to locally produced ingredients. And so hops, we want to be able to produce hops locally. And so some of our challenges then are trying to grow some of those Pacific Northwest hops here in Lincoln and throughout Nebraska. It's
You don't
it's
think
a different
this is
growing
the
environment.
Pacific
so there's lots of
Northwest?
challenges.
Yeah, not
Exactly.
the same. Yeah. So have you collected hops that are growing on farmsteads or wild hops?
So my best adventure, I guess, was we went kayaking down the Loop River, I think North Loop maybe, and collected some hops up there. And so hops grow naturally anywhere north of, I think, like the 35th parallel, which is, I think, middle of Kansas-ish. And so they grow pretty well throughout Nebraska, and they're all over the bike trails and old railways and that sort of thing. And so they're really all over if you know what to look for.
Now, is there also an invasive one?
Yes. We try to avoid what is it, japonica?
It's japonica, yeah, an invasive one that can be a problem. Okay, so you collect, and then Stacy, talk a little bit about where your original research was and is, and differences you're seeing, and then Keenan weigh in on where we maybe go from here with it.
So as you guys have both been discussing, the Pacific Northwest is where 97% of the hops is grown in the U.S., but Michigan is kind of where I shirt-tailed my work off of, because I figured, well, north of the 35th parallel is where we're looking at, and we fit in that really well. The problem we have in Nebraska, though, is our weather predictivity. It's pretty crazy, and so that was the basis of my research, or the exploring, was to see if these plants, we could have any sort of production technique on these plants. And some of the cultivars are more conducive to our environment, and that's something we're seeing quite well. And Chinook is a very popular one, and it's been fairly uniform and consistent year after year here. And I was expressing to you earlier about the problem with downy mildew, which did wipe out the hop industry 100 and some years ago. And we have that at one of our locations really severely. And so hops can either be resistant to downy mildew, it can be tolerant, or it could be susceptible. And so we're actually visually seeing that now. And Chinook is one that's really quite resistant to it. So.
And some of the problems that Stacy just described is really the motivation behind our breeding program. So a lot of the native material, or the stuff growing wild, naturalized, I guess, the main purpose of collecting that and working with it is that we think it harbors local adaptation traits. It hasn't been selected for brewing qualities, so typically that's not very good. And so the idea is to combine local adaptation from the local material with brewing qualities from stuff grown in the Pacific Northwest, and hopefully get the best of both worlds.
And come up with a really, really good Big Red beer.
Hopefully.
Or something.
great.
Like.
That'd be great. That's the goal.
So in the process of collecting the breeding material and then doing the breeding, where are you doing that?
So hops they grow like a weed. It's ridiculous. They grow, what, a foot to 18 inches a day during their peak vegetative growth?
Yeah, there's about a 4-week period in there where they're growing around 10 inches to up to 14 inches a day. And so that's the struggle we're having on the production side, is with our heat. It pushes it along.
Yeah, they grow really fast, and so they're easy to make crosses with and work with. So we grow most of our hops here on East Campus at UNL, either in the greenhouse, we can work with them in there, or we have a couple of field sites. And then also, we've been fortunate, it's a pretty good industry to work in, and so we have quite a bit of on-farm research going on too, and so where we can grow and test new varieties or new management practices, that sort of thing.
That is something really cool we found, is working with the growers that are into hops and beer. Everybody likes to work together, and that has been refreshing for me, because a lot of times you struggle finding people to work with. So this has been really good.
Well, and I know you do workshops and all over the state, really, is that correct, on trying to help the brewers and the industry themselves learn more about it, or are they really more for the home industry, or both?
Well, so I've been leading the charge on the extension outreach and education on that. Keenan has been involved with them because he has some interesting things to bring forward. But my target audience are people that are exploring hops, so they're interested in it, but they may not have grown it yet. So we want to educate them on how to grow it. And then we have some that are already growing the plants. And it's kind of a really cool network to exchange ideas. And it seems like no matter how many times you talk about the basics of producing this plant, it's like they hear more information or new information. So I think the teamwork of everybody working together, we will potentially have some successful commercial growers, I think, in Nebraska.
Well, and the whole point would be, you've got to do something with it if you're going to grow it, and if there's not a market for it, or it's not the quality, it's simply not going to work.
Well, and that's some of the biggest challenges I know Stacy tries to address in some of those introductory workshops is, one, growing the plants is a problem, having all the infrastructure and specialized equipment. It's not an easy transition necessarily from row cropping systems to growing hops. But then also, once you harvest it, how do you harvest it? How do you dry it down? What do you do with it afterwards? How do you market it? those are
Right.
big challenges.
So that's the exchange that needs to happen right now are these brewers. The small brewer is able to handle the hop cone, which is used in the brewing process. They can go on and use the whole cone, but that's not typical in industry. They typically want pelleted products. And actually it's moving towards more of the essential oil is what they're headed to, but Nebraska just is not going to be able to hit that right now with small growers. So that's the neat thing about having these small brewers, microbrewers with the growers is they can deal with it because they're only putting in, what, half a pound, a maximum of 2 pounds in a barrel of hops when they make
Yeah,
it.
it's not very much.
Cool. Well, if you're watching us on Facebook, which you should be, we want to hear your comments. We want you to comment on whether you like what you're hearing, whether you want the university to do more of this kind of research, whether you really like certain beers. I'm pretty happy to hear that from people because we had that discussion off air, who likes to drink what. But make sure that you watch us and comment on Facebook, 6:30, and then we come back, of course, on YouTube. So everything gets posted to YouTube after we do this. All right, so let's explore a little bit further, just for people who really may not know. It's a vine, not a vine.
Which means nothing to me, but
It's that botany stuff,
Well,
Keenan.
I was exploring this plant really closely because I was working on another publication for people to better understand the plant. It's a pretty interesting plant, and the plant average age is between 7 and 10 years in that underground structure. But if you can think of like your tulip bulbs in your garden, that when they grow up, then they have to regenerate something from the bottom. Well, hops is very similar like that, and the rhizome, the underground rhizome, is actually stacking itself on top as it grows. And so then the new buds for the next year are generated in that next growth. So a lot of this management is to deal with that. The plant not only is a rhizome, but I found out it also has stolons, and that's what those really long runners are that are spreading everywhere. And I know I've had calls from people that have it in their yard, and they said it's just taking over. How do I kill it? How do I kill it? And it has to do with the management in such a way to keep that plant nice and tight. So, but yeah, so it's a perennial underground, and then it's annual top growth, that's cut off at the end of the year.
So sort of a classic herbaceous vine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So are you going to be able to, in your research, contain it, get it down to a smaller? Because I know that we're looking at 18 feet for the trellising, or 12, or I know
there's definitely a range. Most
Yeah.
commercial systems are, what, 18 to
20.
18 to 20 feet-ish in there. So
Yeah, so the hops that's grown in Nebraska are the Americana type cultivars, and they tend to be these big monster plants. But the European cultivars, a lot of them are shorter, 8 to 10 feet. And I have one, which is Pearl, but it just doesn't grow real well in our really warm temperatures that we have. So, and the problem is the maturity of the plant. So it has to be about 3 feet high before it'll even start flowering. So that's why they're grown on these tall trellises.
yeah, and it's a big component of our breeding. So you can select different plant forms. So some look almost like an ice cream cone, some look, like an inverted cone, and some are cylindrical shaped. And if we choose or select for the plant forms that are more cylindrical, it lets more light into the canopy, and so it helps with production and some of those kinds of things. So we are making some of those selections.
So are you also, so it's early,
Yeah.
right? So are you also going to be looking for either a wider harvest window or a compressed one? What makes the most sense?
So for us, well, Stacy can address that, but it is a challenge for us in working with what I call native material versus the commercial stuff. That we have, most of our hops are flowering right now, but our native stuff hasn't even started yet. It probably won't flower for another few weeks. So there's definitely a timing issue, and that's something we're going to have to work on. And I don't know if there's a benefit to later flowering or not in
Well,
Nebraska.
there are benefits to having different times of these. So they are photoperiodic or responsive to day length before they start flowering. And I can't imagine having 2 acres of hops that has to be harvested in a 2 or 3 day window.
Right.
So through varietal selection, a grower could have maybe 4 cultivars, and that would allow them to time their harvest so they can actually not only manage it because they got to harvest it, then they got to dry it, and then they have to process it. So it's kind of nice to have them tight rather than have it drift over a 2-week period. And that way they could actually use different cultivars to make a nice production plan.
So is the actual drying down and all of that done all over the state, or does everything come into a particular location?
That's a big challenge, and we've seen
Yeah.
a full range in equipment.
Yeah.
If you were to pick a plant by hand, what's the estimate? About an hour per plant
Yeah, it is.
to pick the cones.
And how many?
You can get about 1,000 plants in an acre.
Okay, that was my next question.
And
1,000 times
the
1,000.
estimates are about a pound per plant.
Yeah.
They'll range.
And it's up to 2.5 or 3 pounds for more higher production. So it's a long process, right? And so people will host picking parties and that sort of thing. The beer's not served till after the picking's done, typically.
So nobody falls off the ladder or what?
But then there's machines that do it,
Right.
and Stacy has a cone picking machine that works pretty well.
When you have the little one that we used up at your demonstration in the backyard farmer garden.
Yeah, that's the hopster that we have that
Right, yeah.
strips the cones off and sorts it, kind of like a combine in a way.
Yeah. Most of the good big ones are imported from Germany, and
Right.
they've been sitting in a field for
Right.
hundreds of years.
But people don't, do people have their own drying equipment, or is
Well,
it kind of hit and miss?
The drying
right now?
part's not too difficult.
It's the
You can
screens.
just use a screen, chicken wire screen, throw the hops on there, the hop cones, and then just use a blower fan. There's different types of setups to optimize that, but really that part's not difficult. It's the dealing with trying to dry the plants down to the right moisture in August when it's a little humid in Nebraska.
No.
It's a bit of a challenge. And then what to do with them after the fact, like
Right.
Stacy had talked about, getting them pelletized. Not everybody has access to that equipment.
Right.
The problem is when we harvest them, because we're dealing with a particular timeline when we harvest, the cone needs to be a certain moisture because we know the development of the lupulin has hit a certain level, but also we don't want to lose those aromatic qualities that people like in those craft brews.
Right.
So they're usually harvested, believe it or not, at 77% moisture, which is like mowing your lawn.
It's pretty high.
It gets hot really quick. So that's a real drama is to get these cones off the plant and get them into these screens and get air blowing through. And we don't want temperatures very high.
Yeah, we can't add heat or it starts breaking down those aromatic compounds.
Right. So it's just a lot of just air going through these
So
things.
it's a little more complex than plant a hop and pick them.
For ornamental purposes, you can do that.
Ornamental, that's right, exactly.
And actually, that's a cool byproduct of this is
It
they do
is.
use it in the floral industry
Yeah.
for floral designs, and then they can make wreaths, which are kind of neat.
Yeah, we've seen a fair amount of that. So, all right, so is this it's a great industry. I mean, it's not really a cottage industry anymore. So what do you see for the potential moving forward, either in the research, or is this a 5-year, 10-year, who knows what we're going to discover? What do you think?
Well, for me, from the breeding perspective, anytime you make a cross between two plants, you're making something new, essentially. And so the trick is just finding that new thing that is actually good. But it's a multi-year process. Typically, most breeding programs are anywhere from 8 to 15 years or more. So it is a long process. We just made our first crosses last summer, and so that starts our 8 to 15 year cycle. So it's going to be a while.
And in the meantime,
Right.
we'll drink the beer.
Hopefully
that's-
grow other parts of the industry. Yeah.
Exactly. So any final parting shots on either problems, good, bad, ugly, about this whole industry or the plant itself or the research program? Anything come to mind?
I think the main thing is people need to be really smart when they're going into this. So if they want to grow it in their backyard farm as a hobby, that's great. But if they're really thinking of going into the industry, they need to look at all aspects before they get too far into it. And that's why I recommend people try about a 1/4 acre, 1/2 acre, so they can actually see what they're dealing with before they do it. But I think there's a potential market. It's never going to probably be that monster market, but it's definitely going to be a niche market that people can see an income from.
And is there a website that you want to have us put on air for you or talk about, or association, either one of those?
Well, I have a blog that I'm providing information pretty timely, and it's called hopsnebraska.home.blog, which is nice. And then we have the UNL Hops website that's in our department. And
our department is?
the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture.
All three of us,
Yeah, so
we're colleagues in the hall.
Yeah, we're
Right,
trying to keep
right.
the information up on that, but the blog actually is, I'm getting information out there quite routinely on that, so people can at least keep up with it.
And there is a lot of information online, so it's important. Your source of information is really important, particularly with hops, because there's such a difference in timing where if 90% of the industry is in the Pacific Northwest, you know, using that information might not work well here, so it's important to get local information where you can.
All right, excellent. Thanks, guys. Well, that is all the time we have for Digging Deeper with Backyard Farmer. You can watch a new Digging Deeper on Facebook every Sunday night at 6:30 p.m. Central. Do not miss Backyard Farmer Live every Thursday at 7 p.m. Central on NET. Thanks for digging deeper with Backyard Farmer.